Hello everyone, great to be here and great to meet you all virtually. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about me before I begin properly. So I'm Ian Leslie, I write books about human behaviour and I consult with companies on communication and workplace culture. And before I started writing, for a long time I was a planner, creative strategist in agencies and clients. And I still do that some of the time, and sometimes I get to combine these two halves of my career as I do today. So that's great, and I love doing that. So today, I'm going to combine those two halves and talk to you about the right kind of mindset to get through this moment and to survive and thrive beyond these sort of unprecedented and really very strange times. And I'm going to identify three principles or three rules that I think will help you and help your companies and your teams get through this moment successfully. So the first rule, the first mindset rule that I think is going to be useful to you is to think beyond the moment that you're in. Think beyond the moment that we're in. So everybody's talking about the pandemic. Everybody's talking about the economic consequences of it. We're all very much focused on what's happening now, today, tomorrow, next week, next month, and understandably so, right? It's an incredibly unsettling and dramatic time. But what that does is it exacerbates an inherent human tendency to magnify the importance of the moment we're in and forget about the longer term. So one of my favourite quotes from psychology, and in fact from anywhere, it's a real touchstone of mine, is from the psychologist Daniel Kahneman. So you probably know a bit about Kahneman. Kahneman is the author of Thinking Fast and Slow. He's the guy that invented this kind of System 1, System 2 framework for thinking about our cognitive biases. And when he was asked a couple of years ago, if you had to distill your immense research and learning over decades into one sort of nugget which helped people live happier lives, what would it be? And he said, it's this: nothing in life is as important as you think it is whilst you're living through it. Right? So we have this inherent tendency to exaggerate the importance of the moment that we're in. So it's why we buy stuff that we don't want or need and then wonder why it doesn't make us happier. It's why we greatly exaggerate setbacks, right? So you spill your coffee or you have an argument with somebody at work and it seems like this kind of huge disaster and within hours or within days, it's completely insignificant. And this just happens all the time. You see it in the news cycle as well, right? Every headline sort of screams importance and significance. And then it turns out in a few weeks or in a few months, you could have just missed all that stuff and you'd still pretty much have an understanding of where the world is at. So we place too much importance on what's happening now, and that means that we miss the bigger picture. And that's also, of course, why why companies cut brand spend during a recession, because they're over-focused on the now. I'm going to say a bit more about that before I move on. So one of Kahneman's points one of his big findings when he researched happiness was that what makes us happy is what we remember, right? So there are things that make you happy in the moment, right? Having an ice cream, right? Whatever it is, which is great. Go and have ice. I'm a big fan of ice cream, so are my children. But the ice cream is not going to contribute to your happiness over the long term. The things that make you happier over the long term are the things you remember, and positively. And so Kahneman says, focus on creating future memories. And that, from his point of view, usually means hanging out with people you love, with friends and family, and doing interesting things with them. And you can see there's a very clear analogy to brands here, right? As brands, we often get very focused on the now, on making the sale and making the conversion now. And we tend to neglect the importance of creating memories in consumers' minds of our brand, of creating branded memories, which is effectively what brand equity is, right? And if you go back to the research of Les Binet and Peter Field, who did the biggest body of work on advertising effectiveness, they have this kind of very rough rule of thumb, which you've probably heard about, and it really applies to perhaps the bigger businesses more than smaller ones, but even so, it's a good rule of thumb to bear in mind, which is that companies should be spending about 60% of their marketing budget on brand equity and about 40% on brand activation. Now, I think that when you're in an economic hole, as we are in now, when you're in a recession, then media lots of things actually become relatively cheap. Actually, lots of opportunities open up. And you should think about your spend in the way that Warren Buffett thinks about buying stocks, right? So Warren Buffett said, well, why am I successful? Well, I like to buy stocks when they're cheap. People seem to have an idea that if the market is rising and everything's going well and the stock's going up, then that's the time to buy. And I've just followed the opposite principle, which is, well, if the market's really down, or if this stock's doing really badly, but I see value in it, then I'll buy it when it's cheap. And I'll reap the rewards later. And the same applies to brand equity. I think now is the time to invest in brand equity. And of course, that does mean investing in media, which have been proven to build memories, to build equity over time, and that does include radio. So that's mindset rule number one. Think about the moment think beyond the moment that we're in. Focus on creating branded memories, and buy brand equity when the price of it is relatively cheap. Mindset rule number two is connected to the theme of one of my books, which is curiosity. I think now more than ever, in this moment, is the time to practice really deep curiosity. And it's a time to ask big questions, to ask the big whys. Okay, so what do I mean by that? Companies that become incurious about the environment in which they operate tend to suffer and die in the longer term, right? And it happens again and again. Look at Blockbuster, look at Kodak. These were companies that had very successful business models. And the thing about success over the long term is that it tends to dim your curiosity about what's happening in the world around you. So companies like that become incurious about what's happening to their consumers. They become incurious about changes in technology because they think, well, why should we be trying to learn about what's going on? We know how to make money. And then, Netflix or Instagram comes along and takes the rug from under their feet because they are much hungrier and they've been trying to learn about what's going on at a much more intense rate. And this is particularly important when your environment is changing as it is now, right? The one thing we know is that the moment we're in is changing everything. This crisis is kind of dragging us into the future. And that's the way to think about it, by the way. It's not a setback. It's not kind of pushing us back. It's just pulling us at a very uncomfortable rate fast into the future. So Leon Trotsky, the chief marketing officer of the Soviet Revolution, described war as the locomotive of history. Right? War is a terrible thing, but what it does is it drives you further into the future. And I think this is true of a crisis like the one we're in now. Trends and patterns that were already unfolding are being fast-forwarded and speeded up. So you need to really kind of think about what's going on, and you need to question some of your fundamental assumptions. And I mean that, quite practically, right? What I suggest you do is you get together with your senior team and make a list of what you know. I'll put that in heavily inverted commas. Make a list of what you know about your business, about your brand. What do you know about your consumers? What do you know about your messaging? What do you know about your media mix? And once you've got all those out on the table, then effectively try and rip them apart, right? Interrogate every one of those fundamental assumptions and say, how could we have got this wrong? What are we not seeing here? If the business fails in 1 year, 2 year, 5 years time, what will we go back and say, oh, why didn't we see that coming? And if you do that really rigorously, then a lot of those assumptions will come through relatively unscathed, unless you're, really running the opposite of a tight ship. But some of them will change, and some of them will change radically. And just by focusing your curiosity on those fundamental assumptions, you'll, to a certain extent, you'll reinvent what you're doing and make yourself fitter for the moment after this moment. Okay, so that's mindset rule number 2, which is, ask the big whys, practice deep curiosity, and use this crisis as an opportunity to question your fundamental assumptions and see if they can be improved upon. So mindset rule number 3 is to use the power of conflict, positive conflict. I'm just suggesting you all go back to the office and you get into a fight with each other, or get into a Zoom fight. I can't imagine what that would be like. Less danger of physical injury, but probably not very fun. So what happens when everyone agrees with each other? When you're in a room with your team, or when you're talking to your whole company, and somebody proposes a point of view or a decision, and everybody nods and goes along, the chances of that decision being a good one are considerably lower than if you had a real debate and there was disagreement in the room before you got there, right? Number one, that it might be the wrong decision. Number two, even if it's the right decision, you'll find that when you have debate and disagreement and conflict in the room, the quality of that correct decision actually goes up. It becomes much more kind of fleshed out and detailed. It's been interrogated firmly. And what I think is happening in a lot of workplaces is that people are wary of disagreement and conflict. In some cases, it's the opposite. There's just too much conflict and open conflict and disagreement, people getting into fights. But I think the bigger problem is that people avoid it altogether because they're worried about hurting each other's feelings, they're worried about rocking the boat, and I think that's harmful to the quality of decision making. Okay, so why is that particularly important now? Well, your environment is changing very fast and you're all under a lot of pressure. And when you talk to teams, as I did for my book, who work under extreme pressure in very unpredictable environments, you'll see that they put disagreement and conflict at the center of their list of things to get right. So I talked to teams of mountaineers or astronauts. And when you study the kind of internal cultures of these teams, one of the rules they follow is that we have to be able to disagree with each other openly and honestly and quickly. And if I'm screwing up, you have to tell me. If I think you're screwing up, it's got to be okay for me to tell you. Now, that doesn't mean you all have to be, horrible people to each other. Quite the opposite. You'll often find that teams come together and become emotionally closer when they have that kind of culture of open disagreement. But in order to protect some people's feelings, people who are not used to that, you have to lay out the ground rules and warn them about it. So in operating teams, the senior doctors will sometimes say to the junior medics, look, when we're in the middle of this operation, there may be times when I say things that seem to you brusque, and it might seem like I'm upset with you. I'm not upset with you. I'm just telling you what we need to do right now. Or if you're doing something wrong, I need to tell you right now. So disagreement, honest disagreement and conflict speeds up decision making and improves it at the same time. And I think when we're in this strange, unprecedented and transformational moment, it's more important than ever that we all come to terms with it and get better at it. Okay, so those are the 3 mindset rules I'd like you to take away, really. Think beyond the moment that we're in. Use this moment to question your fundamental assumptions and unlock the power of positive conflict. Good luck.